As Chinese President Xi Jinping meets Donald Trump in Florida, are their respective countries as far apart as ever on reaching consensus on a number of sensitive issues, or will they succeed in finding some common ground? I'll be talking to a former U.S. ambassador to China to hear his views. I'll also be talking to a Chinese academic to ask his views on whether a rising China is likely to be a challenge for the U.S. and hear his view on that and many more. Welcome to The Point. I'm Liu Xin. Chinese President Xi Jinping is set to meet his counterpart, U.S. President Donald Trump, on Thursday at Trump's Mar-a-Lago club in Florida. With the stakes as high as ever, the Mar-a-Lago summit stands to be historic. According to the White House, the two leaders will exchange views on sensitive issues like the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or DPRK, and trade. Top from both sides have indicated they will try to make the meeting a success. Yet some have raised doubts as to whether the world's two biggest economies can find common ground. So how important is a personal rapport to foster closer diplomatic ties, and what could this first encounter mean for both countries and the rest of the world? Someone who's seen it from the inside is Stapleton Roy, former U.S. ambassador to China. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Ambassador Roy, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. Now, you were U.S. ambassador to China from 1991 to 1995 and have witnessed the ups and downs of U.S.-China relations over the past few decades. How do you look at the significance of this upcoming summit?
Any summit meeting involves dangers and opportunities, and that's especially the case when the leaders of China and the United States meet together. In this case, the Trump administration is brand new. Many of its senior policy positions have not yet been filled. But I think that this meeting is important and can produce a very positive outcome. Most important, I think, is for the two leaders to see if they can establish a personal relationship that will help them deal with the many difficulties of the bilateral relationship. And secondly, I think it would be helpful if the two leaders could establish a framework for addressing the difficult issues, such as trade, such as North Korea, that can't be simply solved in one summit meeting, but require an engagement between the two countries over an extended period of time. That would produce, in my judgment, a very good outcome for this summit.
Well, you have recently said that during your 60 years in Washington, D.C., you've never seen this kind of transition in U.S. politics. What exactly did you mean by that?
Well, this is the first time in United States history that our president has no political experience or background. He is a very accomplished, successful business person dealing with real estate issues. But knowing how to work Washington is a very complex issue in itself, and many of his most senior advisors also do not have the extensive Washington experience that you normally have in a new U.S. political administration. So there have been some mistakes made during the early days of the administration, but Mr. Trump, President Trump, has shown an ability to make adjustments when things are not going properly. And therefore, I think that he has the potential to have a successful administration if he can get the right people, the right advisors into the right positions, and if he can pay attention to people who have the extensive background that he and some of his closest advisors at the moment do not yet have.
Well, you just described kind of a learning curve. Do you think this has been reflected in his policy or rhetoric when it comes to China as well? And do you think that finally he is coming to the right senses in dealing with China from now on?
Well, President Trump has a characteristic that he showed extensively during the campaign, that he will speak very frankly on issues that he does not have a full understanding of. But the positive side is that he has also shown the ability, which some of our presidents have not had, to make adjustments. If he says things that go too far, he will make corrections.
Well, let's talk a little
and
bit.
I think that has...
Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, let's talk a little bit about...
I was just going to say...
Yeah, go ahead.
You take it from here.
Okay, let's take a look at the kind of give and take that might take place during this summit in Florida. What do you think are the most important things President Trump would try to take away from the meeting, and what do you think the most important things on the mind of President Xi when he leaves Florida? He wants to present it to the people of China and to the rest of the world.
I think that both presidents see benefits in having a stable relationship between our two countries. And they recognize that while we have some very difficult issues, such as North Korea, such as the trade problems between our two countries, that we also have many areas where we have been cooperating together for many, many years. And those areas of cooperation I expect to continue. I think both leaders are not looking to have complicated issues solved at this summit. But I think they would like to have this first meeting between the two presidents increase confidence on both sides that they will be able to deal with the issues more effectively by having a good personal relationship.
Now, on the question of the One China policy, which is a central issue for China and which had been seeing some ups and downs ever since President Trump came into office. Now, he recommitted to the One China policy in a February phone call with Chinese President Xi. Do you think this time it might come up in any form? And do you think there is still the risk that a position in the future?
No, I don't. A senior administration official in briefing before this summit confirmed that we are committed to the One China policy based on the 3 joint communiques and on the Taiwan Relations Act. So I think that the One China policy now is established as the way that the United States is going to address that aspect of our bilateral relationship.
Well, he has also been tough on other topics on China. For instance, he has been putting extra pressure on China when it comes to DPRK to the Financial Times, where he said if China doesn't do more to pressure Pyongyang, the US will do it alone. He also said that this is going to be a very difficult meeting with President Xi. What do you think he's trying to do by saying these tough things right before? How do you look at the kind of response that China has been showing to all these different rhetorics he has given out up to now?
Well, I've been dealing with this issue for many, many years, including the period when I was ambassador in Beijing. It's very clear that both China and the United States are frustrated by the fact that our individual efforts and our joint efforts have been unsuccessful in preventing the DPRK from developing nuclear weapons. Both of us feel that it would be much better for both of our interests if we could have a denuclearized Korean peninsula. We tend to think that China has not done enough in this area, but I've heard many Chinese officials say over the years that the United States has not engaged politically with North Korea in a satisfactory fashion.
What is your view?
So there's a tendency on each side to try to blame the other. My view is that there is no way to deal with this problem if the United States and China are not working together. The idea that we can take unilateral actions that will solve the issue, I think, is not the right way to look at the question.
How do you look
in my judgment? Yes?
How do you look at the proposal by China on the dual suspension, both by the DPRK to suspend its nuclear activity, suspend testing missiles, and for the US and the Republic of Korea to suspend their large-scale military drills for people to be able to start considering negotiations again?
I think the aspect that is most important in not being present in the Korean situation. Let's compare it with the Iranian situation. The leader in Iran signaled very clearly to the outside world that he wished to end Iran's isolation, and that led to the 5-power talks that helped to produce an agreement on the Iranian nuclear issue. What is missing from North Korea is any indication, any signal to China, to the United States, to the international community, that it is prepared to engage in a positive process that could help to stabilize this situation and hopefully eventually lead to a denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So I would like to see the two countries work together to produce a positive reaction from North Korea that it is willing to engage on this issue.
Let's talk a little bit about trade, as this is also another key issue on the agenda for President Trump. Now, he has laid down the line to call for an even playing field for U.S. companies in China. How do you look at the trade imbalance between the two countries?
I think that trade is an area that we need to have some very serious talks about. I have worked with the American business community in China for many years, and most of the time they have had a positive attitude toward their investments in China. That has changed in recent years. And now many American business people feel that they do not have a level playing field in China, and I think this is something that China in its own interest. But at the same time, we in the United States have a feeling that the trade balance between our two countries is tilted too much in favor of China. So I think that in order to make sure that the economic relationship contributes to a good bilateral relationship, we need to address these questions frankly, and I hope that we can establish a framework at this summit for beginning to address those questions in a spirit of looking for a win-win outcome for both countries.
Finally, if you were the U.S. ambassador to China now, what would you advise President Trump, to pay attention to while dealing with China, while dealing with the Chinese leadership?
If I were to brief the president, what I would say is that the U.S.-China relationship is going to be our most important relationship for decades ahead. And therefore, you need to adopt an approach to China that doesn't result in constant crises, but establishes a basis for engaging on important issues between our two countries so that we can end up in a constructive long-term relationship. We need not a short-term perspective on China, but a long-term perspective on China. And I think that that is possible. And my experience in dealing with China over the years is there is no issue so difficult that good leaders are not capable of moving the relationship in a more positive direction.
Thank you very much, Ambassador J. Stapleton Roy, joining us from Washington, D.C. And you have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin, here on CGTN. We'll take a short break, and I'll be back right after that. Over the past 500 years, the rise of one state often disrupted the position of another dominant state. Their relationship would fall into the pattern of the so-called Thucydides Trap, the outcome of which was usually war. As an alternative approach, Chinese President Xi Jinping brought up a new vision for its relationship with the United States, calling for no confrontation, no conflicts, mutual respect and cooperation for win-win results. What should be done to avoid conflict between China and the U.S.? Earlier, I spoke with Professor Zhang Weiwei, Director of the Institute of China Studies at Fudan University. I started by asking him how China and the U.S. could avoid this Thucydides Trap and forge a win-win relationship. We also discussed the trade barriers between countries as well as the DPRK, which are expected to top the agenda for the two leaders of the two countries when they meet in Florida.
Yeah, actually this idea of Thucydides Trap is very much a product of European history, which is full of military conquests and based on this mentality of zero-sum game. If I'm stronger, I should beat you, you know. But this is really not part of the Chinese historical legacies. If you look at Chinese history over the past 2,000 years or even longer, essentially the theme of Chinese philosophy, especially Confucianism, is about this you may call harmony in diversity, or in today's word, win-win, peaceful coexistence. So really, the world is so large, we can find, you know, increased, expanded interest of cooperation, where we can, both countries, rising status quo power, can benefit.
Well, one thing that a lot of people in the West do not seem to understand is China's obsession with this kind of relationship, or the acknowledgement of the US side about the content of a new type of relationship China wants to forge with the United States, namely the four characteristics we have been hearing: the no conflict, no confrontation, mutual respect, and win-win. Why is it so important for China to hear to hear these principles from the United States?
Ideas and principles are crucial. No conflict, no confrontation, win-win cooperation, and mutual respect. As we look at history, indeed, major powers do have conflicts of interest, and sometimes they go into wars with each other. But if we have these four principles established and guide our relations, bilateral relations between China and the United States, so we can usher in really a new era of globalization, new era, a new phase of Sino-US relations, which will be hugely beneficial not only to the Chinese people, the American people, but also to the world at large.
Well, Donald Trump has been advocating America first, while Chinese President Xi Jinping has been promoting the concept of the China dream since 2012, calling for a great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Do you think the dreams of the two countries have common ground, that we can achieve these dreams together without I win, you lose, this kind of scenario?
On the one hand, I do have some sympathy for President Trump, and after all, if you look at the statistics, indeed, many Americans failed to achieve the American dreams over the past 2 decades. And so he has to take care of some of the interests of his constituencies. Yet I do believe these American dreams and the Chinese dreams can be complementary, can be made complementary. If you look at the Sino-US trade as an example, I remember when I was first visiting the United States over 3 decades ago, Sino-US trade was roughly $6 billion. Now it's closer to $600 billion, 100-fold increase. Just imagine how many Americans, how many Chinese have realized their dreams in this sense of 100-fold increase. For core, I'm pretty sure that that's the case. We can continue to build on this existing strong economic relations and try to make it better and create more interests for both peoples. Just look at the American companies. So many companies have benefited for their investment in China. And many of them actually have created more profits in China than in the United States.
Well, one of the things that the Trump administration has been accusing China is that American companies have not benefited enough or as much as Chinese companies have benefited while doing business in the US, for instance. And that is why trade and economic issue is said to be a key issue on the agenda for the two presidents. According to a senior US administration official, and I quote, the US wants to work with the Chinese in a constructive manner to reduce the systematic trade and investment barriers being created by China that has led to an uneven playing field for US companies. Is there this kind of systematic barrier in your eyes?
No, I think perhaps the American audience should also hear the Chinese side of the story. From the Chinese point of view, at least from my point of view, this systematic barrier, if there were, the United States has certain responsibility, if not a major responsibility for. In other words, you look at trade, for instance, China hopes to buy a lot of things from the United States, but the United States still impose a lot of restrictions on what China can buy, what China cannot buy, especially in high-tech sector. Indeed, this trade deficit, to my mind, can be overcome overnight if the United States is more generous in terms of allowing Chinese companies to buy whatever they want to buy. Same with investment. You just look at the, say, the case of Apple and the Chinese company Huawei. I do think the Chinese company like Huawei has encountered more difficulties in accessing US market, while US company like Apple encounter less difficulty entering the Chinese market. Actually, many US companies have made such a huge amount of profits. They made more profits here in China than United States, than in other markets. Take General Motors as an example. Actually, its investment in China really helped to save its operations in the United States. Yeah.
Reality is reality. However, perception is perception, people would argue. And I think a lot of the problems right now is arising from the kind of misperceptions the U.S. public has about China's economy, about China's growing status, or about what China tries to do in the future. How do you think President Xi can persuade President Trump during their meeting to understand that reality and perception is not the same thing, and that the two countries can really sit down and work on some of these toughest issues you've just mentioned?
Yeah. In many ways, this meeting between the two leaders hopefully can set a tone for the coming 4 years of the bilateral relation between two countries, especially in the field of trade and economic matters. I do believe it's possible. For instance, I'm thinking of this controversy over different, who gains more, who gains less. Ideally, I think we should pursue this win-win approach. In other words, we try to have a positive balance, rather than facing the existing pie, which is fixed in size, who will cut which part, who will cut which part is bigger. Let's build and create a bigger pie and then discuss how to share. So both sides will gain from this. So this positive balance is a great idea for bilateral trade relations and investment relations.
Well, another urgent issue facing these two leaders is the DPRK nuclear issue. President Donald Trump has again talked tough while accepting an interview before the meeting to the Financial Times, saying if China does not rein in Pyongyang, the United States would do it alone. And at the same time, the DPRK has just tested another medium-range ballistic missile. How do you think China and United States can find compromise on the DPRK issue during this 24-hour meeting?
I think, the Chinese position is very clear. China is strongly opposed to nuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. China is also opposed to any acts of war in the Korean Peninsula. And indeed, I think you have to look at the situation on the Korean Peninsula. What I see as a Chinese scholar is a situation where you have South Korea, the United States still maintain this Cold War stance against North Korea. And ideally, if you look at the situation on the Korean Peninsula, China and North Korea have already evolved into a post-Cold War relationship. So perhaps we should all strive for post-Cold War relationship in which we should really make this armistice agreement, which is essentially ceasefire agreement, turn this into a peace treaty, without which North Korea will have a strong sense of insecurity. So this is a fundamental approach.
Do you think there is any possibility for President Donald Trump and President Xi during this very short meeting to have some kind of general agreement or general consensus on where to go in the future on this issue?
I'm not very sure. Ideally, they can find consensus or agreement on this whole issue of the Korean Peninsula and nuclearization, etc. Yet, it's not all that easy. After all, this is their first meeting. It's not that long. Perhaps they can. This meeting can help them to get to know each other, and hopefully to strike a personal relationship. This is already good for maintaining good relation between China and the United States and for regional peace.
Yeah, but in the overall development of U.S.-China relations, how would you describe the significance of this meeting, the first ever between President Xi and President Donald Trump, and in the very informal atmosphere?
No, I think it's important. I try to summarize this relationship at this particular stage or this particular event as a sign of what I call from uncertainty to certainty, or at least to a measured degree of certainty. If you look at the election campaign in the United States, so much campaign rhetoric against China, and people have a lot of uncertainty about the future of Sino-US relations. But now we see the two leaders meet each other in a friendly atmosphere, in the summer resort of the US president, very casually, informally, and chatting with each other. I think all these are good signs which provides the minimum degree of certainty that the two countries and their relationship are roughly under control or even in reasonably good order. So this is crucial. This message is important for China, for the United States, for the world at large.
And here is my last point. Let's not expect magic from this first meeting between the two presidents, but at the same time, let's remember that you only get one chance at creating a first impression. Naturally, all the disagreements between the two countries will take time to get worked out, and there will need to be a minimum amount of mutual confidence for any relationship to prosper. Hopefully, the Mar-a-Lago summit can provide that minimum level of certainty needed by both sides to move forward. In the words of President Donald Trump himself, though, it has to be reciprocal. That's all for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the CGTN Live application to watch our show on your mobile devices. For previous shows, go to the CGTN channel, click on the playlist and look for The Point with Liu Xin. Thanks for watching. I'll see you tomorrow at the same time.